So I'll start by just introducing myself. I'm Puja. I'm the founder and CEO of Devie, which is a personal coach. We're working on building a personal coach that supports parents of toddlers and preschoolers to understand and manage their children's behaviors and emotional development. But today, what I wanted to talk to you about was really how we might use tech to support parents in their children's early years and sort of what we've learned so far. But before I get started on that, I wanted to go through a bit of my background and kind of why this problem and why I'm speaking about this, I suppose. So in the past, my background has really been in bringing tech and design to solve really difficult human problems. So I started my work at the Presidential Innovation Fellows during the Obama administration, where I worked in child welfare at the Department of Health and Human Services, really to make public services support vulnerable families better. And we did that using often digital tools and design. I then moved into the World Bank Group, where I was and the Embed team, so that's kind of their nudge unit, if you're familiar with that, and was really focused on early nutrition. So again, not necessarily something you would immediately associate with kind of tech and design and innovation, but really was where kind of I was working on bringing those approaches. And next, at the City of Austin, at the Office of Design and Delivery, I worked on elder care, again, bringing tech and designing tech to solve these really difficult human problems that often are not particularly technical or haven't had the sort of technical, maybe disruption is the wrong word, but technical involvement that there could be, or innovation that there could be. And now I'm doing that for parenting support. So that's sort of the background that I'm coming from. And what I've learned over that time is that these are sort of the areas where tech can really help. And so one might think, why even use tech? There are tons of other ways that you could solve these problems. And I certainly was one of them, especially around parenting. In fact, at first we started experimenting with parenting classes. But what we found was that these kind of three characteristics of accessibility, personalization, and scale and consistency were the things that were really missing in each of those other kind of situations that made tech kind of a positive, the right tool to use to solve that problem. So let me go into that in a little bit more detail. So why parenting? One was that is a big problem. So 1 in 3 children globally don't meet standard developmental milestones by the age of 5, and parenting is the #1 explaining factor of those gaps. What we found was that inaccessibility in parenting, so thinking about that first reason why tech is often a good tool is to unlock accessibility, there's inaccessibility in parenting support that's due to price, due to location, due to judgment from both peers and providers, and from just information overload. And I have a few examples. So in terms of unaffordable price, this is something we heard from one of our beta testers, and we hear kind of over and over again that parents are looking for sort of specialized support, but they find that support quite unaffordable. The other is there's location and judgment. So we often heard that parents had to go quite a long way to access that parenting support, whether it was to a doctor or to a specialist or to a community center or whatever it was. So the physical location itself could be a barrier. And the other almost more important one was the judgment of other parents. So in a survey by 0 to 3, they found that 45% of parents of young children feel judged all the time. And we heard that even these small things, like, for example, the fact that in this session, they had coffee for £6 that they were offering at this community center, made a parent feel like this was not support that was meant for her. The next is information overload. So we heard this from tons of parents that Google stresses them out, that that when they seek that kind of information, they end up more lost and aren't quite sure how to make decisions accordingly. And so parents are really struggling with finding information that they can trust and finding information that they can actually put into action in their parenting. So that information overload problem also contributes to that inaccessibility. The other big tool that that makes a good problem for technology to solve was that personalization problem. What we found in parenting was that a lack of trust comes from impersonal, one-size-fits-all information. And here's an example of that. So many parents told us that they don't trust information from people who don't know what they're going through. So that she has her sister, they have like a small circle of advisors who they turn to for advice, but it's very difficult. Parents are very skeptical of information that doesn't feel personalized to their context. And the other element of that is the inflexibility. So we heard from many parents that when they're looking at peer-to-peer forums in particular, or even talking to experts, they often get this advice that says, you know, you have to be doing this thing, and if you're not, then you're wrong. And that is what contributes to a lot of, well, feeling judged to start, but also just not trusting information, because if there's inflexibility, it makes it feel not as objective. And so that's really kind of the other element of why we thought that tech would be the right tool for parenting, was because there was that personalization aspect or impersonal aspect that comes from people just not knowing the context and not being willing to be flexible with what the advice actually is. And finally, there was a lack of evidence. And so this relates to that last characteristic of a problem that makes tech kind of the right tool. And that is that scale and consistency are really difficult. So here this met that exactly. And the perfect example is that in the UK, they had a huge investment into Sure Start centers, which were kind of community, like early years hubs of services that are still in many communities all over the country. There was a ton of investment into this, but what they found was that when they actually ran the randomized control trial and the evaluation to see if it was actually effective in improving children's outcomes, it was a very mixed bag at best. And so what we found is that the ability to deliver that quality support consistently and at scale is really, really difficult through these in-person interventions. And so again, what we saw was this sort of 3 check marks around parenting. So 1, there was an accessibility problem. There was a personalization problem, and there was a scale and consistency problem. And this is why we thought that tech would kind of be, that parenting was sort of, that tech would be the right tool to support parents in their children's early years. And so our design challenge really became, how might we support every parent in a way that's accessible, personalized, and scalable? This is sort of the how that I want to go into, of how we kind of use tech to support that. So what we did was we started with a ton of user research. We then identified some patterns and opportunities. So if any of you are familiar with product or the human-centered design cycle at all, this will look very familiar. So diverging and converging. And let me show you actually what we found. So at that first user research stage where we first diverged, here was kind of like the insights that we found when we converged. So one was that parents feel isolated and stressed in their children's early years. And everything I just said, that the support can be overwhelming, it can be difficult to apply, it can be judgmental, and it can be inaccessible. And so our big insight from there was that this might be a good use case for a technical solution, and that's what I've just walked you through. Next, we prototyped. So we tested a WhatsApp prototype, and what we found was that when we tried to give parents kind of activities and things that they could do with their children at home, in every feedback interview we had with parents, they said, that was great, but what I'm really struggling with is sleep, or what I'm really struggling with is behavior. So our big insight was really that we have to take care of these core pain points before we move on to this kind of more potentially aspirational stuff. So if you're thinking about, school readiness or literacy or any of these sorts of things, we needed to start where parents were, which was around behavior, it was around food, it was around sleep. And that's kind of was our big insight from that prototype. Next, I suppose we did another prototype, but we're calling it an alpha on Facebook Messenger, where we actually had a bot that would speak to parents back and forth and have these sort of digital coaching conversations. Our big question, and that really came out of that, was how much we really need AI. So I don't know if I mentioned this before actually, but Devie is an AI coach that uses natural language processing to have daily chats with parents where she helps them understand and manage their children's behavior. But what we found was that on Facebook Messenger, we couldn't really enable any of that. So what we did was we just kind of constructed these decision trees. And what we found was that parents were still quite engaged and still getting the advice they needed. So there was a big question around, like, how complicated do we really need to make this? The other thing that we had on there was we had an escalation feature to humans. So we had the option of at any time you could click to talk to a person, a real life parenting expert or coach. And what we found was that almost no parents escalated in our testing group. And when they did, they weren't having very high quality conversations. So when they were talking to Devie the bot, they would type paragraphs, they would use emojis, they would just be very expressive. The quality of the conversations was high. On the other hand, when they spoke to a human, it was just a much less, it was very much just kind of a question and an answer. And there was much less sort of back and forth and quality in that conversation. And when we actually interviewed parents about why that was happening, what we found was that, interestingly, it was that relationship that mattered. So parents told us that they felt like they knew Devie over time and they were able to get comfortable and talk about those things. Whereas with the coach, because it was a different one every time, they didn't feel like they could confide. And so it was super interesting that that relational element is so important, but it doesn't necessarily need to be with human. And so our core insight was that steady relationships are what define if parents keep interacting, even if those aren't with a human. And then I suppose most recently, a few months ago, we released our app for beta for iOS and Android. And what we found was that 80% of the chats on Devie were about behavior. So we happened to release right around the time of lockdown. So we got quite a few parents that sort of found us and started using it. And we found that organically, almost all of them were clicking on the tantrum part of Devie. So they were talking about behavior, they were talking about fussy eating, they were talking about potty training, resistance, whatever it was. So that was one of our big kind of insights. The other was that parents who wanted activities and things to do with their children to keep them occupied didn't really want to chat. So when we were talking to them back and forth and asking them about what kinds of activities they wanted and stuff, they weren't super interested. And then finally, one of the really interesting things we found was that when parents had a free response question, and this might have been also because it was the lockdown time and people needed more help. But what we found was that when they had a free response question where they could type something to Devie, we got a lot of sort of messages that indicated people were looking for well-being support. So they said things like, I'm really struggling right now. Do you have ways that can help me feel less stressed? Whatever it was. And so what we realized was that parents really needed that emotional support as well. So our big insight was really that we needed to focus on holistic behavioral support, because that's clearly what parents were sort of telling us to do, and provide those sort of quick hits of value rather than necessarily always having these longer chats. And we needed to also do that holistically, meaning we needed to provide that emotional support for parents as well. And so that's really kind of all. I'd like to sort of wrap up there. Over the last few months, this is kind of what we've learned about how we might use tech to support parents in the early years. So the first thing I started with was kind of why tech in the first place, and why is parenting kind of a good use case? And that's really because of those three factors. It's that parenting support can be inaccessible, it can be impersonal, and it can be very inconsistent at scale because it's done by kind of so many humans. And the other element was sort of the how. So over time, as we sort of went through that diverging and converging process, what our sort of core insights were. And those are really coming to the user research. It was, we needed to start with the pain points of parents, so really starting with the challenges. With our WhatsApp prototype, we really learned the first thing we learned was that tech was kind of the right solution. The next was that we really need to start with those challenges. And then in the messenger, we realized that that relational element is really important, but not necessarily with the human. And then on our beta app, what we realized was that we needed to focus more on behavioral support, provide that holistic support to parents. And when they want those activities and things to keep their children occupied, do that in a really quick hit kind of way. So if I want to, I hope at least that I've given you kind of an overview of how at least we have gone through our discovery and learning process for how we can use tech to really support parents in their children's early years. And I'm super open to your questions. I'd love to know kind of if any, if you have any questions or anything that you'd like to know from me. So I guess I'd love to know, like, just from the folks that are here, maybe if you guys could do like a tiny little one sentence about like why you're here in the chat, or if you want to join the chat, join the actual conversation, I'm absolutely okay with that too. Very cool. So by young people, you're meaning more. Okay. Very cool. I have a few folks back from my White House days that were doing sort of similar things. It's really exciting. And what have you sort of learned about kind of, I guess you've learned about the power of technology in sort of a more creative way for those young people. Have you learned anything specific about kind of how you've been able to use technology to engage them? Sorry, which city are you in, Patrick? Oh, okay. Very cool. All right, everyone. I know there's just a few of you left, but I wanted to thank you so much for attending, and hope you learned something. Hope you, or rather not learned something, hope you found that valuable. And I would love to continue the conversation via email or Twitter or LinkedIn, anywhere that I'm available to connect, really anywhere. So thank you so much again for attending. And I hope you have a great rest of your conference.